Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Really good to talk to you again. Although we don't have a lot to be happy about on the world scene, it's getting very, very ugly in France right now, in Paris in particular. And, just have to think about all of the warnings that Ron Paul has given us in the United States and in the Western world. It seems pretty obvious, if you could think objectively, that when you strike out at people and try to take things away from them, they might get angry. And so there's this whole concept of blowback, and I believe Ron Paul was suggesting on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website, as he has throughout and did in his, when he was running for president, noted that the reason they're over here is because we're over there, and it drew all kinds of hisses and boos. But it seems so logical, and it's hard for me to understand why people don't believe it. But in fact, there is a very interesting video posted at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity now by Michael Scheuer, or Scheuer, I guess is how you pronounce his name. The Paris killings are blowback. Could you perhaps tell our listeners a little bit about what Michael is saying there?
Sure. Well, to start out, there was an interview with Dr. Paul the day that the attacks in Paris took place on Wednesday, and in this interview, Dr. Paul was on Newsmax, and he was asked some questions about it, and he's the one who first raised the issue that there is an element of what we call blowback in this kind of attack by radical Muslims, apparently by radical Muslims on this magazine in France. Mm-hmm. He talked about how France has been involved in these foreign wars in the Muslim world for many years, in Libya and elsewhere, and it's been going along with the U.S. And in the case of Libya, actually, France was in the lead, pushing the U.S. to attack Libya. France has been involved in many places elsewhere. Has been very involved in supporting radicals in their attempt to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria.
Uh-huh. And
he's simply pointing out that when you're involved in these things overseas, eventually it does happen that these things come back to hit you back at home, and that at least is partly a partial explanation for what happened in Paris. And of course, the usual suspects, as you pointed out earlier, Jay, the people who clacked their tongue when Dr. Paul said such things in the debates and elsewhere, did the same thing, and even some jerky websites said he was excusing it, or he said they have it coming, which is, if anyone knows Dr. Paul would know that's absurd.
Of course.
The libertarian philosophy does not endorse non-defensive violence in any way, shape, or form. So trying to understand the motive of a criminal is an absolutely natural act. It has nothing to do with endorsing the behavior of the criminal.
Yeah.
So, but this is how it is. The jingoism takes over, Jay. And you remember on Wednesday, everyone immediately started pulling these signs out. Je suis Charlie. We are identifying with this magazine who, of course, it was tragic and it's horrible, but the jingoism and the mob mentality and the collectivism takes over. And anybody who stops to point out, well, let's look a little bit deeper into some of the causes of this. Let's try to understand what's going on. That person in this sort of twisted faux reality becomes an apologist for these people. Mm-hmm. And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, even if it was an attack on free speech, that presupposes that somehow in the Western world we have free speech.
Yeah, that's true. And as Chris Rossini, who writes over at Target Liberty, made a great point. It's a great point because it's so obvious that people who are arguing that this is about the First Amendment, which of course they don't have in France, but this is about free speech and the First Amendment, completely miss the point of the First Amendment, which is the First Amendment was meant to protect us, the American people and Americans, from their own government and their own government's attempts to restrict our speech. Has absolutely nothing to do with what happened in France at all. So it's really a distortion of that idea of the First Amendment in the first place.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that we do have a certain amount of free speech here in America. We are able, you and I, are to talk about things, to criticize our government here on this venue. However, the larger and the more powerful you get, the bigger following you have, I'm not so sure how free we are to speak our minds. Otherwise, why would there not be more controversy in the mainstream?
Sure, and look at people like journalist James Risen, who has been hectored and harangued by the U.S. government for years, threatened with prison time because he refuses to hand over his sources to the U.S. government. Look at the free speech of some of the whistleblowers some of them are in hiding.
Mm-hmm.
Snowden is hiding in Russia,
Right,
and others are in hiding here, and others are in prison here in the U.S. As you well know, Jay. So it's also a selective freedom of expression and free speech.
Well, it certainly seems to me, from what I haven't really followed this story in France as much as I would if I had nothing else to do, I guess. But I'm wondering, to what extent might it be widespread? Might this not be a new and growing threat against the West, a retaliatory threat against the West, and might be somewhat more planned and more organized at a larger, from a wider group of angry Muslims?
Well, the attack itself was so strange in so many ways. We read another article by one of my favorite writers, Diana Johnstone, who speculated at the end that this is going to give a field day to conspiracy theorists because there's so many very strange things about it. But one thing that's not strange, it seems to be a common denominator in a lot of these attacks, that we found out today, is that French and even U.S. intelligence had been well aware of these of the suspects, these two brothers, and had in fact been following them and monitoring their activities. And indeed, they were on the no-fly list for the United States. So they were clearly in the sights of the intelligence services. Yet somehow you and I are being felt up at the airport, and these guys are roaming around shooting people and this sorts of things. So it's an absolute failure in what they tell us we have to do in exchange for security, because we give up our liberties and we have no security. So
Right.
It's an enormous failure on that respect.
Right.
As well.
What good does it do us to gather this information on 100% of the American people and the French people or whoever else? These listening devices we have now, these monitoring devices that Snowden pointed out are being used to interfere in our freedoms and our liberties. What good is it doing if this kind of thing goes forward anyway? I mean, they had these guys in their sight, and yet they got out and did all that stuff. So,
what's really interesting is that apparently what the French government has determined is that these two alleged attackers were doing it in the name of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And if you know, that is an organization that's been targeted by the United States for a long time. And in fact, in the speech that President Obama gave in September, he spoke about the U.S. policy toward Yemen, the anti-terrorist policy in Yemen, as the model for U.S. Anti-terrorism policy in the world. And that obviously has fallen flat on its face, if that's the case today. Mm-hmm. And as you actually alluded to earlier in the show, Jay, what that does is it just proves Ron Paul right in what he said all along, which is that they come over here because we're over there.
Right.
Not we have to go over there to keep them from coming over here.
You know, Daniel, you also put out a piece on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity in which you question how many countries are we at war with now? I mean, it's I guess the title was "How Many Current U.S. Wars? Let's Ask Obama." And we're everywhere. I mean, it seems like the United States and NATO has got a presence almost everywhere. And it really hit home recently when I heard some of the neocons suggesting that we should have done in Iraq exactly what we've done in Germany and Japan and all these other countries. We've kept our military presence there. I guess that's what these guys want. They want to have a military control around the world, all over the world if possible.
Yeah, that's true. And the piece that we put up was interesting because it was taken from a document that the president is required by the War Powers Act to supply to Congress on a biannual basis. Mm-hmm. And basically the president is required to tell Congress in which countries the United States is currently involved in hostile activities. Mm-hmm. where there are U.S. armed forces deployed, equipped for combat. And so, according to President Obama's own admission to Congress, the U.S. is at war in at least 14 countries right now. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the list: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. We know that Somalia, Yemen, but Cuba,
well,
Niger, Chad, Uganda, Egypt, Jordan, Kosovo, Central African Republic,
and Tunisia.
So we have a military presence. Is that what that means?
It's not a military presence. It's U.S. troops equipped for combat.
Okay, so we got guys and guns and some ammo there, ready to go after the local people if we need to, if we want to.
Yeah, essentially war.
And what about then drones? Perhaps we can always put drones in over somebody's airspace and kill them if we want to.
That would expand the list significantly, I think.
Yeah, incredible.
It was interesting because it was using the president's own message to Congress, where he's admitting we're in 14 wars.
Yeah, and we should just understand that these people should just understand that we're there for their good.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the logic? I mean, what is going through our heads? Why do we think that these people should be happy that we're there?
Well, that's why that's where you get blowback, and that's the blowback of the U.S. Interventionist foreign policy.
But isn't that the hubris of America, that we think that we are so wonderful, we have something so great? And I honestly believe there was something, Daniel, one time to American exceptionalism when we were a republic, when we were more of a free market, limited government country. I think that you could make the case for some form of American exceptionalism. We were different. It seems to me that what we've done now has really gone back to act like all empires do act.
Unfortunately, you're right. I mean, I think there is still, I don't like the word exceptionalism because it sounds odd, but there is something special. And I mean, you and I know you are, Jay, and I know I am. We're both patriotic, and there are things we love about America. There really are a lot of opportunities. Yeah. The problem is that the neocons and the interventionists and the people who are stealing our money here at home, they want to ruin it for us. So that's why we're doing, you and I both, is what we're doing, and that's why Dr. Paul's been doing what he's doing for 40 years. Right.
If you have parasites in your body, you try to get rid of them. You try to find a way to get to reduce the threat. And to me, that's what we have, is a parasitic threat to our national security, actually making us less safe rather than more safe. Speaking of the countries that we're involved in, it's interesting enough looking at this list that you just gave me. I don't see that we have the Ukraine listed there.
Well, technically, we don't have combat troops outfitted on Ukrainian soil.
I see.
So that's a little bit down the road. You're getting ahead of yourself.
Okay. But we do have them in Cuba. That surprised me. I was interested.
Yeah, well, think about Guantanamo.
Oh, well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. So. All right. Well, in any event, Ukraine, we haven't talked about that today, but if we could just touch on it for a moment, perhaps. I'm really looking forward to this movie that Oliver Stone is in the process of producing. It should be interesting. His things usually are. But I was also sort of encouraged by something I read today. The Czech Republic's president came out and was saying that really only poorly informed people don't know about the Ukraine coup. And this was encouraging to me because it suggests that a country that is part of NATO is aware, very much aware, and he's speaking out and letting people know who was responsible for unseating an elected government in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and he's earned a position at the almost at the very top of the bad list for Central Europe, or even for all of Europe, because of Miloš Zeman has spoken out quite a bit about the role of the U.S. in the coup in Ukraine. Also in Hungary, the Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been somewhat vocal and has also been vocally opposed to increasing sanctions on Russia. And the U.S., of course, can't stand this, and NATO can't stand this. So they've had the target in their sights. My only quibble with what Zeman said is that he's technically right that only ill-informed people don't understand this, but you have to understand the average person living in the U.S. is fed such a steady diet of propaganda. Anyone who gets their news from the television or from the mainstream press is completely ill-informed. There's no way to become informed.
Yeah.
So, we can all pat ourselves on the back about how we have such a wonderful media, the fourth estate, that's informing the public about the actions of their government.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's not the case. It's only the so-called alternative media and independent media, like your program and others, and what Dr. Paul does. That's the only place that you can find an alternative to the heavy propaganda that's constantly shoveled out by the White House and the media.
I'm wondering, Daniel, just what the chances are that NATO will allow this guy to last long, and there could be his demise could be forthcoming if he doesn't shut his mouth, huh?
Well, what's interesting is that, and I'm not getting too heavily conspiratorial here, but it's interesting that just a couple of days before this attack happened in Paris, the French government said we need to find a way of ending sanctions against Russia. So there's going to be a summit on the 15th of January, and basically French President François Hollande was saying that if there's any progress made in this summit about Ukraine, we really have got to end these sanctions on Russia. So I think the Europeans are coming apart at the seams to a degree, and I've hesitated to say that until recently, but I think there really is some evidence that this may be the case. I have no idea whether that has any relation to what happened in Paris this week, but it's interesting to see that the West Europeans are also very concerned, and you see the Central Europeans such as Hungary and Czech Republic have been concerned for some time. It's hurting their bottom line. It's hurting our bottom line as well here in the U.S.
For sure.
If you look at what's happening in Texas now with the artificial suppression of oil prices,
right,
we're going to see some major economic fallout from this policy of the U.S.
Well, Mr. Putin talked about sanctions would result in a boomerang that would hit the West. And I think it's happening. I mean, you have the oil prices. There's lots of concern now about oil companies, marginal producers that have a lot of debt on their books, and they're in trouble. The equity markets are worried about it. So when you have a global economy that is so highly leveraged, Daniel, with huge amounts of debt, then when you start having just the smallest amounts of, and this isn't small, we've seen a 50% decline in the oil price, you start to run into some big trouble, and like dominoes, they can hit each other and knock each other over very, very rapidly. And I think your point is well taken, that it's a different kind of blowback, perhaps, a financial blowback that we could be looking at here from our own actions again, just as we go over and with our bombs and military presence, make people angry at us and they retaliate. Well, there's some retaliation, and it seems to me one of the things people are overlooking is demand for oil has been extremely high. I just read today that as high as it's ever been, and Russia now has a lower cost of production because their currency has been suppressed. They're selling huge amounts of oil, and of course China and Russia seem to be getting closer together. And I was reading in the New York Times last week about how the Maoists are starting to gain a lot of power again in China. It seems as though they are really starting to speak out against Western influence in China. So I think all of these issues are coming together in a way that are very destructive of our country.
Have you seen anything in the gold markets today that reflects some nervousness in that area? I mean,
well, I think the problem with the gold markets is that the market that we get, the paper markets, is a fraudulent market. The one that the quoted gold price and the COMEX, and David Jensen and I talk about this on our weekly podcasts almost every week. It's much like the news that we get. The news that we get about the gold price isn't reflective of the real strength in the gold markets, because there's 100-to-1 paper contracts that are out there by major banking interests that definitely want to keep gold out of the picture. On the other hand, though, and they want to continue to print dollars and continue to use those dollars to reallocate wealth from the people that earn it into their own pockets. But the Russians and the Chinese and the other BRIC countries are tired of the IMF and the World the Bank and the institutions that came out of the post-World War II reconstruction, and they are setting up their own system. And that's what I think is really interesting about how Russia and China are working together, Russia and Iran are working together, and more countries, even our closest friends, are starting to trade with China in not using dollars, U.S. dollars anymore. So I think we're, things are really starting to change, Daniel, and I really think the things going on in Paris, in France, I think it's all part of the same phenomenon. Unfortunately, I believe that we'll just keep our eyes on what's going on. But if we just if we just stayed with honest money, going back 1971, and Nixon was a great enabler of the chaos that is really starting to, I think, accelerate right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about shooting ourselves in the foot, huh?
Yeah, I would say so. But of course, it was all allowing the money printing was allowing the military industrial complex to expand and get our presence in all these different countries, and to buy out and to bribe and to change governments. And at some point, I think you were talking before we went on the air. You were talking about these different countries that have been bought out in one way or another by NATO. Belarus was an exception. Jimmy Rogers pointed out to me that Belarus was a country in which a lot of the Western countries were able to sell their products into Russia through Belarus. So the point is that Belarus would not allow themselves to be overcome by the Anglo-American Empire and NATO. And I think China is standing firm. I think India will stand firm in their own way. Russia's standing firm. And so we're setting up the Trans-Pacific Partnership apparently as a means and a strategy to try to seal off China and to try to maybe weaken them somehow so that we can so that they can become the prey of the ruling elite. I don't know. I mean, this is all way beyond me, but it's fascinating to watch. And I want to thank you again, Daniel. Anything else you might want to add about what's going on in the world scene today before we conclude our discussion this week?
Well, I think these are incredibly dangerous times, and I think we're seeing a real strong reaction in France. I think you might see a real backlash against Muslims. The idea that everyone is collectively to blame for the horrible actions of a couple of deranged people. Yeah.
Well, that's really true, and certainly there is a reaction in Europe, and has been, not only against this sort of problem with Islamic violence, but also from financial violence of sorts.
Absolutely.
And people are getting very, very tired of it. Marine Le Pen in France, for example, and England has their reaction as well as other countries. So, it's natural when people kick you in the shins, you have to stop it somehow. And anyway, the best answer is to try to understand what's going on. That's what we try to do on this show. I know that's what Ron Paul has always been about, education and helping people understand. And what really alarms me in a way, Daniel, was the reaction of the Republicans when Ron Paul suggested when Ron Paul suggested that we might remember the golden rule when we treat other countries the way we did. Boos and hisses. You would think those fine Christian folks of the Republican Party would have thought twice about booing and hissing at an idea like that. But anyway, we'll do the best we can, Daniel. I want to thank you again for shedding some light on what's going on in France, Ukraine, and elsewhere.
Well, thank you very much for having me back, Jay.
You bet. We'll do it again next week. Thanks very much, Daniel.